As a part of my next batch of content, I will now be laying down some baseline principles and guides on what I think are key fundamentals for playing competitive in any game, but especially with a focus on Team Fortress 2. And today we're going to be starting off with the importance of individuality in gameplay, and how that really has defined every sort of major innovation when it comes to the competitive side of things in nearly any game in esports as a whole. So to start off with, we have the baseline principle of metagames, right? Metagames, they're the best for a reason. They usually just work the best as a baseline sort of strategy, as a method to just get people on the same page. But then what usually ends up happening is that metagames just keep getting countered, and people get so focused on the concept of a metagame that they forget that they're actually playing a game. The first players just starting to play a game didn't really have all of this highly intricate work documented, no real guides to it. All they really had going for them was just their desire to pioneer things in their own individuality. And if you go and think about that and try to apply that to the modern day, right? How do things get improved? How do people develop strategies and metas? It's not just going to be from repeating the same exact things as other people. It's going to be trying to figure out what works best for their team and why, or just what works best against what enemy team in a given scenario. What usually will end up happening, though, is that you'll have one really strong sort of like method of play or metagame, and it works really well for a few teams. Well, more so to reach to individual playstyles here, right? It's like you have these one or two playstyles that become seen as so assertive and dominant, and just so widespread. And what ends up happening is that people end up not understanding the why of why these things are done. They only really get told that these are the best things to do, and they don't really end up asking themselves why. They don't really end up thinking for themselves, and so what will end up happening is, over the course of multiple generations of gameplay, you just end up seeing a bit of a decline as everything becomes watered down more and more over time. Things are just developed less and less as people try and go with what works best, instead of trying to figure out what will work best for what reason. The largest issue usually reached with more developed metagames is that people just sort of stagnate and just want to go with what keeps working. And then whenever they figure out what makes it not work, they just immediately cling to that, rather than just like trying to think on their own 2 feet, right? And trying to figure out what they themselves need to do in a given situation. They more so instead just like tilt focus on like what's happening, rather than realizing the benefit of what's happening and realizing what they can do against it, yeah? It's just that sort of like pigeonholed meta-based mindset that really ends up running you into issues, I'd say. You're not always gonna find a position where it's like uncounterable, and you don't just want to like keep getting countered by that same thing, and you don't want to switch to the same exact counters. This is going to apply usually more for something like King of the Hill than Stopwatch. Stopwatch is a lot more like directly linear, but King of the Hill a lot of the time is just direct fighting and directly adapting and basing your play off the enemy team. That's a lot of it is cause-effect, so to say. It's an important thing to remember at the end of the day is that every enemy player is a component. Every player of your own team is a component. They all have their own emotions. They aren't flawless people in-game, and they're going to have variance and inconsistency. But even within that context, they're still going to have their own patterns. And so what ends up being most important is having a baseline to sort of work from, but then making sure you just base most of what you're doing and most of your thought process to determine what the enemy team is going to do based off what you know about them, the patterns you've seen. A lot of the time people are going to stick to what works in their own patterns, right? So it's like being able to like kind of predict like that and wrestle the initiative away ends up giving your team such an invaluable advantage, kind of going along with just presenting the enemy team with options that you want them to see, rather than giving them the ability to just have control and select the options that they want to do. So loop back around though. Let's say a certain hold or a certain play works better for a certain team, right? And it's just like they're so dominant that it's seen as, I don't know, uncontestable, right? But then it's like you try and end up mimicking that play style. Let's say it's, I don't know, something like Soldier or Pyro, maybe a Spy, and you just try and end up filling a box that your team doesn't need or that you aren't as good at filling. And what ends up being most important 90% of the time is just finding out what works best for you and what works best for your team and working around that rather than trying to fit into like a whole entire different scenario than what you're in. It's like every different team is made up of 9 players, including yourself, right? And every different team is going to function differently at a core level, and you just can't overlook that sort of thought process and mentality going into things when you're working on like your mental state as a player and figuring out what you need to do. If you try to mimic something, you're always going to be less effective than the original source of that. So it ends up being very important to figure out your own strengths and weaknesses as a player and be playing off of that. The enemy team is going to be seeing the same strengths and weaknesses that you do. They're going to be seeing the same opportunities that you do, and you can't always be relying on them to make mistakes by just trying to cling to the meta things and hoping they don't know the exact cardboard cutout response to counter it. That just ends up not being very valuable long-term, especially as you move up in the divisions and counter more capable opponents. So in order to counter generational decline, the only answer is just to create a bit of your own momentum, to create a bit of your own mentality, and just see how you can bounce it off of other players and what's already out there as it is. You don't just want to be trying to do the same things as other people. You just want to figure out what works for you and why, what worked for other people and why, and then just try and combine a bit of everything. The way the games keep progressing is by just combining all of that, unless you get exceedingly lucky against an enemy team or through your own team. And when you're playing for the long term, playing for the health of the game and the growth of yourself as a player, you really have to focus on the long term, bigger picture there. So what this all means is that in order to be a pioneer, you actually have to be a pioneer. And I feel like that's just an aspect a lot of people end up overlooking. They just keep doing the same things and expecting things to change, and sometimes they do change, but usually not to their favor. And if it is something that changes, it's usually only temporary due to the enemy team making mistakes or just not being as aware. And you just can't be relying on gimmicks like that to be winning out games for your team in the long term. You really just have to actively be working on things with your team and all figure out what's going to work best for you, not what worked best for other people years and years ago. Generally speaking, though, the only answer to how to win a game is to play your own game. You can't be playing somebody else's game, and the only game that matters is your own game. Everybody else should be thinking at it from the same mentality, and just, at most, be trying to learn from what made your game, and for what reasons, rather than just on the fact that it was successful. So to carry this along, and to somewhat evolve this idea into something else, let's go and take a look at the concept of momentum. So momentum is just your ability to start adding pressure and to keep adding pressure on the enemy team. And what that ends up doing is snowballing over time. You give the enemy team less and less time to react, and you wrestle more of the initiative away from the enemy team so that they're not putting you in positions where you're going to be making as many mistakes. Rather, it's you putting the enemy team in a position where they're going to keep making mistakes. You just keep applying the pressure on them, and if they have a more like out-of-game sort of mentality and rely on what worked in the past, they're usually going to experience a lot of issues with adapting to that in the moment. But what really defined good players was never their ability to just do what they were told. I think that much is fairly obvious. It was their ability to just adapt and keep adapting. And that's when other people started like making metagames based off of them and following their strategies just because it worked out so well due to their own capability to think for themselves. And if you're not really thinking for yourself, then you're just doomed to failure. What'll typically end up happening is that people end up playing a game more like they're reading a book, right? Like they're just flipping between the script, trying to figure out what to do next, when the answer is typically right before them. If it's something like a Kritzkrieg, they'll usually either just all back out and walk into the same exact spam sight lines out of fear and die to it. If it's a sniper, they all fear him, or they all don't fear him way too much, but individually. It becomes very important to all just commit to something as a team, and it doesn't matter whether it's right on paper or not. What ends up being right is what ends up working, and what ends up allowing your team to achieve something together. What usually allows you to just develop that sort of mentality long term is to write things down to a cause-effect sort of thing. A case of like, oh, their medic died at this time, they're going to immediately either commit for our medic or back up if they're smart. And you can just sort of come into things with that expectation, And that allows you to just predict what the enemy team is going to do and have a response worked out to it, rather than always trying to play the same way, because the context is always going to differ. But if you're able to just compartmentalize things into patterns and put those patterns into each enemy player, and then also reapply that process to your own team, you're able to think, what does the enemy team think I'm going to do in this situation? What do I know the enemy team is going to do with this situation? And then what can I do off of that? Rather than just, oh, this hold is good because this player told me it was good, or oh, this hold seemed good. You need to focus on what would make it good in the moment, or what would make it bad in the moment, right? You just need to be able to independently analyze everything and write a lot of things down to patterns, because at the end of the day, the game is extremely reactive. It's extremely cause-effect, and if you don't understand that for yourself, then your growth is going to be somewhat limited in the long term. Back to the question at hand, though. Momentum is your ability to find an advantage and to keep exploiting that advantage to give your team a better long-term outcome versus the enemy team. It's finding that one thing out of three things that does work and seeing how far you can go with it. And what usually ends up helping along with this is just testing the waters versus a team, remembering what you know about them and how they're going to act in certain situations, and just pushing that as far as you can to throw the enemy team off their game and allow your team to play more to their strengths. Examples of this sort of mentality can be found with forward holds on something like Asheville or Product, things that just force the enemy team to deal with the threat at hand right away, so that you can't let them organize the play that you're going to know they're going for. It's really easy on something like Asheville, for instance, for their soldier to just bomb across, right? But if you have your combo playing more aggressively, all with your medic, all working towards the same goal, making sure the enemy teams and soldier can't get into as good of a position to sack, then it's going to work out better than if you're just waiting passively on your ramp for the enemy soldier to bomb into the same exact spot where your medic's always been at, right? And I feel like that's pretty obvious, but it ends up being overlooked for some reason most of the time. People just end up waiting for what they know is going to happen, and in doing so, they just give the enemy team so much control over the game and how they're going to play. I feel like to hammer this point home, you only really need to take a look at real-time strategy games. So let's take a look at something like StarCraft 2, right? You have the Terran, the Zerg, and the Protoss. With the Zerg, you have a lot of aggressive techniques, right? You're just constantly focused on pressuring the enemies, on getting people in behind, on just worming your way in at any opportunity the enemy gives you, and just making sure to keep them on their feet and prevent them from being able to sit comfortably. You have a very defensive and passive sort of playstyle with the Terran, a lot of traditional fortifications and entrenchments, and just making sure that your defenses can't be breached, but if you never really have the opportunity to get up on your own 2 feet and set up those defenses, for instance, if you just keep getting Zergling rushed, then you're going to find yourself in a rather uncomfortable position unless you adapt your own strategy or are prepared for that. You can use that same sort of knowledge of the enemy's aggression to your advantage by just presenting them with what seems like an option and making sure you can just deal with it, right? And that way they're not allocating the resources in a more efficient manner, and you're able to wrestle the initiative back. I guess an example of this to compare to TF2 would just be something like CP Steel, just allowing the enemy team to aggress into something like Wishbone, have most of their focus be there to deny the E point, and then just having people collapse on them from behind, from D or so. Just have all these different resources in places where they can all control different parts of the map, right? And then Protoss would be your very high technique, kind of more neutral and adaptive play. I'm going to go ahead and give some concrete examples of what the sort of Terran-based play would be in this case. Let's take you're playing Pyre, right? You're taking a lot of spam and damage as a team, so what you end up doing is just going forward to deny that spam, playing closer to your demo man, and their spy and soldier are going to see that same opportunity, and they're going to be aggressing off of that if they're smart and trying to make something off of that. But maybe that's just what you want to end up having happen. Maybe your medic's prepared for that ahead of time and is watching behind. Maybe your heavy's in position to stop the bomb. And that just ends up kind of baiting the enemy team into making that commitment because they think that you're out of position or not on the same page as a team. And the only real way to prevent that, to use that to your advantage, is just to work it out of game and have plans for those sorts of situations in mind, and to be prepared to do something off of it. More important than having knowledge is knowing what to do with that knowledge. And like I said earlier, a lot of teams are going to stick to the same patterns. If a team is smart, they're usually just going to either recommit everything for your medic or all back out and regroup when their medic dies, right? There just isn't really any other sort of play you're going to expect. And so you can use that to your advantage and just have your medic be playing smarter, be backing out sooner, or to have people be prepared to collect free kills. Any play you do, the enemy team is going to see opportunity for, but you can see that opportunity yourself and be aware of that and be communicative with your team to turn that into a positive thing rather than a negative thing. In a slugfest, neither team is going to win besides, well, not neither team. The one with better DM is just going to win straight out pretty much every time there. And if you can't out DM them, which is something you can't really rely on as you move up in divisions and get around to like the top or right below the top, what you have to do is start being strategic about things. And if you can't just out-wrestle them in the meta and outbrain them on paper, you have to outbrain them in actually playing the game. Which I feel like is a pretty simple thing, but people have an aversion to doing so typically, I'd say. So the enemy team sees your medic unprotected, right? And they're like, obviously this is a really good opportunity for us to go in and try and kill their medic. But let's say that's something that you intentionally like want the enemy team to see, right? So that they make a mistake. You want to be forcing the enemy team to be making mistakes in cases like that, rather than just waiting for them to normally be making a mistake. You want to make them think that they can one-up you and get a really good advantage by taking advantage of an opportunity. And as long as it's an opportunity you create, you're still in control of the situation, they're still doing what you want them to do, and you're able to play around and counter it because you don't need to predict it because you know exactly what's going to happen. Or rather, you don't need to react to it because you can predict it. If you're not generally good at predictions, and you have trouble thinking about what the enemy team is going to do, just think about it from your own perspective, right? Okay, I'm a pirate, I go forward, I'm not protecting my medic anymore. What does that mean is going to happen there, right? If we have, like, an advantage, or they want to initiate. Obviously, they're going to aggress on your medic. But this is where the next concept of just initiative really comes in. The team that's aggressing, the team that's forcing the enemy team to react, is always going to be more effective than the team that's being forced to react. And the only way to prevent yourself from having to react is to be proactive and claim space and initiative back for your own team. If you don't, you're just going to keep being pressured into making mistakes and forced into uncomfortable spots where you can't play the way your team is best at. And this is only going to get worse in a match unless you take a stand and seize that initiative back from the enemy team. And that has to end up coming at some point. You have to make that realization, or else you're just going to lose the game every single time. And this usually really ends up happening when you have div disparity in a division. Let's say, like, I don't know, a top invite team versus like a low invite team or move up team in general, right? You're gonna get really bogged down, you're gonna really get demoralized, there's gonna be a huge amount of pressure on you. But if you don't realize how to break free from that pressure, if you get too caught up on the concept of that pressure itself and don't focus on what you need to do to counteract that pressure, then you're still going to lose there. It's like you really just can't rely on your own skill in that sort of case. So you have to rely on your mind, and that's the best weapon you typically have in any sort of game. This sort of mentality also really just lets players reach their true potential and realize their own play styles, rather than just telling them that this is the best sort of thing to do, this is the best sort of play to make. You need to reinforce their underlying principles, right? Reinforce the foundations that they draw their conclusions from. Maybe guide them away if it's so detrimental to a team that it's unsalvageable, but the rest of it, I think, is really things they should learn for themselves. They should really be learning why something works for their team, why something works for them, and why something might not work for them. That's just what's going to allow for a scene to grow over time, and I feel like that's something that's typically been lacked in Team Fortress 2. I feel like that things just kind of keep declining and people just sort of keep speedrunning through the division. Sort of going along with this, each player has their own specialization, right? They're going to find their own play style, and they're going to get known for that play style. And then leaders from there can go and make better decisions on who they want to pick up for what reason. Rather than focusing on just the name of a person, they need to understand what goes behind the name of that person. And I feel like that usually ends up being a pretty decent leadership failure, but that sort of failure is only natural if everyone just tries to sort of do the same sorts of plays, yeah? it's hard to have that information if you don't really have a means to get to that information, and if everybody just tries to repeat things, they just never get their own time to shine. As a leader, you want to have in mind what each component does, what each component specializes in, and pick them up for that reasons. That's always going to be more effective than just picking up a player and telling them what to do for the team. You want to be going into it with the mind frame of, I want to pick up this player. What can they do for my team? Not what can I make them do for my team, right? Just see what they as a person and player can bring to a table, rather than trying to get a player to fill in the gaps that you want for a team. Unless they're sort of built around that sort of flexible, generalized playstyle, you're typically just going to want to pick up a player and have the team play off of that and build around them, right? You want a team to be working off of their strengths, not just the concept of names alone. You just need to be proactively thinking about what you can do with each resource you have, and that's what's really going to bring you success in the long term and allow your team to reach potential rather than just sort of existing. It's like you need to think about it on a deeper level because it is deeper than a surface level there. So to go back to an early idea, I think Zerg represents a lot of proactive aggression. I think the Terrans tend to represent a lot of reactive proactivity, right? The strength of something like a Zerg-centric sort of mind frame is that you're always going to be searching for and finding that one weakness and that one opportunity, and you're always going to be in a position to capitalize off of that. The strength of the Terran, and as a comparison, is just going to be always being able to predict and being able to respond to that sort of threat, and realizing what you can do against that threat. Whereas, like, if it's just a case of, like, aggression versus aggression, the team that's better at aggression is usually just going to win there. Like, for instance, an example would be a Call with Product where both teams have really good DM. It's just like the team that's able to put more pressure on is going to win there. So at some point you sort of need to switch your mindset up a bit and be able to realize what you can do off of every opportunity the opponents give you with. And you don't even need to be making your own opportunities as much because, right, your opponents are giving you it, and you just need to realize how. Then with Protoss, again, always just more concerned with your own technique, micro, and just ability to manage things. It's not directly as based off the enemy team. Yeah. And I guess a usual sort of comparison would be, I'd say aggressive holds typically more like a Zerg-based mindset, or like Kotha in general, really, right? I would say most of Stopwatch tends to lean towards like a Terran-esque sort of mindset there. And then I would say Protoss just tends to be pretty much anything in between, but more suited towards like the general sort of first-person shooter player who isn't necessarily as much of a pioneer, but is just more concerned with playing their own game. And the best answer is typically going to be a bit of a mix of those three sorts of things, and just finding out what sort of mentality to shift between and when. And that's absolutely the most important thing in any sort of competition, to just be able to shift your mindset like that and use what mindset's going to suit you best in a given situation. And refining those three aspects of play, those three strengths of yourself, you're going to be able to find yourself in a position where you're just not really being caught off guard by anything. You're just always able to keep flipping the script and doing what needs to be done in the moment. And ultimately, I think that's where you find the most of your strength as a player. You're just using your own ability to realize all of those opportunities, using what you see, communicating to your team about that, and just playing pretty much primarily off of that rather than relying on something like a more standard mentality and metagame. You just want to have an option set to switch between, typically. In having those three mentalities that you can sort of switch between, you're able to really flip your own play style as well, and just compartmentalize things to be a more efficient player. I think being able to switch between those three mindsets also just helps to alleviate a lot of tilt. You just realize that, oh, this approach isn't going to work in this situation, and then you switch to an approach that is going to be more effective based off of what sort of situation you find yourself in. If you're getting out-pressured, you either switch to being able to pressure the enemy team yourself. Like, so a more Zerg sort of mindset there, or to prey off of all the mistakes that they're going to be making, and to let them see the opportunities you want them to see by adopting a more proactively reactive mindset, right? Because you're not always just going to be able to purely aggress on them. So an example of that would be something like a Kritzkrieg versus a Kritzkrieg. The Zerg sort of mentality there would to be to switch to your own Kritzkrieg and to just try and have a better usage of it with their trying to swarm them with resources while they're overconfident in their own right. Whereas something like a more reactive sort of approach would be to realize that they're going to use Kritzkrieg there when they start aggressing more, when their Demoman starts taking that position, because they're exposing their medic, because they don't have an Uber charge to use to defend themselves. So if their medic gets more forward there, the only conclusion, unless they're making a big mistake, is that they're going to be using their Kritzkrieg there, usually to try and maintain the initiative and kill your medic and players so that you can't get on the point. And using that knowledge, if you're not just directly aggressing back into them from different angles and swamping them, what you have to do is just start backing out ahead of time so you don't find yourself in a position where you're crossing through a choke point and a sight line where they're going to be laying crit stickies down on you there. Whereas a Protoss sort of mindset like isn't really directly as applicable here, but it's more so a case when you need to be like just swapping a bit between the two, right? Where it's a matchup where you need a bit of everything. You want to like strike a balance there, right? Now take something like Pyro. If you need to be playing very aggressively, making a lot of space with your demo man, it's like you're adopting a bit more of a Zerg-like mentality for a bit. If you're playing a lot more defensively, like trying to predict things a lot more, trying to play around bombers and spies a lot more, typically speaking, you'd be a lot more Terran-centric, so to speak. And then the sort of Protoss thing to do would just be to like be doing a mix of the two, yeah. I guess it's more of like real-light out-of-game mentality. It isn't as strong as an example here. But I think that just kind of goes to hammer the overall point. Yeah. I guess the conclusion then there is to just usually have like a bit more of a Protoss-centric mindset there. Focus on your own strengths and be playing off of that until you're put into a position where you either have to just constantly out-aggress the enemy team, or where you're very forced to like react to the enemy team due to the position they put themselves in. I feel like that's a pretty logical conclusion. Yeah, it's like you focus on your own strengths and what you yourself are able to do for your team, what value you're able to bring for them, and just be player-centric until it's a position where you have to like be more oriented around what the enemy team is doing in specific, right? If you always purely try to play to your own strengths, you're going to lose the game. If you always try to play to a more standard sort of concept of a metagame, you're always going to lose. And if you always try and directly out-aggress the enemy team, you're always going to lose. So the answer is usually found in between there. And so if you kind of compartmentalize things like that, get it down to different playstyles, then you're able to find a lot more success in the long term, and I feel like that's a really important mentality to have going forward into things. So to go back to an earlier idea and flesh it out further, I think the Terrans represent a lot of proactive reactivity. It's like you're still reacting to things most of the time, but you're sort of going into that with that mindset, right? You're prepared to just be playing off of what your opponent does and basing your sorts of plays and strategies off that. I'd say something like Zerg is focused a lot more on that sort of like cheese aggression, on just like inherently more gimmicky strats that can really just seize the initiative and keep wrestling people just out of sheer aggression alone for the most part. It's like you're going for a gambit there constantly, you're going to try and catch them off guard. And a comparison I'd make to Protoss would probably be something like Engineer, right? With Engineer, you're kind of just constantly trying to figure out your best tech spots to support your team. Just the sorts of like little micro adjustments you can make constantly, right? It's not usually as focused on being directly aggressive or defensive. A lot of it's just on being more adaptive than anything else, right? you're not necessarily reacting or regressing as much. It's like a more secondary sort of utility and mindset. By using all of this knowledge to your advantage, what you end up being able to do is winning the game off of your own merit, losing the game off of your own merit, and just learning to see things for yourself rather than repeating the same mistakes as the people who came before you and who will come after you. You want to be able to focus on what you need to improve and why, rather than just losing due to having an inferior hold or metagame or overall strategy. It's just so important to be present there yourself and to focus on what's happening in the swing of the moment. And that will give you large returns over time out of game. You're able to just develop things more and have a better idea of game sense, rather than just relying on having everything be spoon-fed and told to you. Ultimately, metagames serve their purpose. They're fine. I'm not saying to disregard the metagame. I'm just saying to have an understanding of it, but also to have an understanding of why you might need a shift from it and how. To just be prepared to find your own metagames, really, and to keep developing and working on those, rather than becoming content with the current metagame and trying to get as far as you can off of that, because that's just going to put your team in a weak spot.